Hello everyone, welcome to a World of Warship Blitz video. Today's video is a follow-up from the last two videos that I did where I looked at battleship lines from the perspective of Tier 6 battleships and I looked at cruiser lines from the perspective of Tier 6 cruisers. Today we're going to be looking at destroyer lines from the perspective of Tier 6 destroyers. Now Tier 6 in many ship lines is where the ship sort of comes into its final flavour. It's not always the case, and we'll talk about those exemptions or those cases where it's not quite the case, but in a lot of cases, by the time you hit Tier 6, you sort of know how that line's going to run. And for destroyers, it's no different from the other lines. At Tier 6, you're pretty much on flavour. In fact, with some destroyer lines, you sort of get on flavour at Tier 5. But the previous videos were Tier 6, so let's just stick with Tier 6. So unlike cruisers and battleships, which are very similar, battleships, for example, they've got a lot of the same constraints: slow acceleration, moderate speeds, sometimes slow speeds, a very slow turret traverse, long reload times. All that means is that you, although there's different flavors and different play styles for the different ships, at the end they're more similar than different. Destroyers have a lot more agility, a lot faster reaction times, so essentially what it means is that you get a bit more freedom in game, so to correct mistakes, although if the enemy lets you correct mistakes because they have a very low health pool. So a battleship, if you make a mistake, you end up out of position. It's very hard to get yourself into a position where you're back in sort of, in the run and protection. With destroyers, it's a lot quicker, but you may not make it because the health pool's so much smaller. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide destroyers along, well, we have to define a way to sort of categorize it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to categorize destroyers by the way that they deal damage, right? So there's two ways that destroyers deal damage in this game. They use either guns or torpedoes. There's no ramming, which is lucky because I'd like it if it was ramming destroyers, because every now and again they get themselves into a position where they could be very easily poleaxed, but that's not the case. So your two options are torpedoes or guns. And the reason those make a difference is that the mechanics for the different mechanisms for dealing damage determine how you play. So what do I mean by that? So let's just take some examples. So torpedoes travel through the water in a set direction for a set period of time and then expire, right? They're visible to other ships at a certain point. So essentially once you fire, there's quite a lot of things that can happen between you firing and the torpedoes hitting, which is why I recommend that if you are getting into the higher tiers, you go and look at how to dodge torpedoes like a boss by Yearboy in his video channel. It's probably the #1 video for changing your game on this in World of Warship Blitz. But what that means is that at a distance, firing torpedoes, you've really got two ways to operate torpedoes successfully. A stealth option where you fire them into ships from beyond range, so that when the torpedoes become visible, then you get hammered and there's not much opportunity to dodge. The other option is what I'd call the close-in shot, where you swing past a distracted enemy and you unload the torpedoes at very short range, so there is no capability to avoid. Firing torpedoes when you're visible at long range can be a problem because it only takes a little bit of course correction for the torpedoes to completely miss. So essentially what that means is that if you're in one of the more torpedo-focused destroyers, stealth, the ability to understand your detection circle, things like that, cover, all that comes into play, right? And the ability to understand and read how the enemy drives their ship, so you can understand if they're straight line drivers or if they've got a bit of awareness around them. At the other end of the spectrum is the gunboats, and so, well, I've been talking about torpedo boats, so that's at the extreme end, is the Fubuki. At the other end of the spectrum is the gunboats, right? So these boats basically deal damage through guns. If you want my opinion, my humble opinion on these boats when you play them, assume that they don't have torpedoes, right? So when I play the Gunevny, every now and again I see comments saying, how do I get the torpedoes on the Gunevny to work? The answer is you don't. You pretend they don't exist. It's nice and simple, right? So every now and again you can get to use the torpedoes, and that's nice when you do. But in an average game, I get 0 torpedo strikes in the Gunevny. Right, so let's go look at the lines as a result of that. So at the torpedo end, you have the Japanese lines. You have the Japanese torpedo boat line and, ironically enough, the Japanese gunboat line. So the torpedo line is very similar all the way through. Starting at the Isakaze, long-range torpedoes, torpedo range beyond detection. It carries on all the way through to the Shimakaze. It's just more torpedoes, taking longer to reload, with more torpedoes per tube, going for longer range. Basically, that's it. Now, these ships are, if you like these ships, they can be great, and they're great in the right hands. But if you're one of these people that doesn't sort of have that awareness, the ability to sort of skirt around your detection circle and things like that, these boats are heavily targeted by enemy ships. Because the torpedoes in them hit so hard, they're a priority target. So if you're visible, chances are you're being fired at. The best way I view, and the Fubuki, the theme continues all the way through to the Shimakaze. So there's not really much change. Small boats, poor guns, not many guns, turrets rotate slowly, long reload. The guns hit hard, but everything else about them says don't, try and avoid using guns. Use them if you have to, but don't rely on them to get you out of trouble. The Hatsuharu is the Japanese gunboat line. Now, this line gets into its own at Tier 8, so the Hatsuharu and the Shiratsuyu are, can be frustrating ships, because essentially they're like the Fubuki. They're basically a Japanese torpedo boat with one less torpedo tube and smoke instead, which means your damage potential goes down, and the smoke really doesn't make up for it, because a lot of the Fubuki's job is beyond visual detection, stealth torping, and it does a great job of it. So if you stealth torping the Hatsuharu, it's got a slightly larger detection circle from memory. I think it has, let's go have a look at these. No, that's not it. What am I looking for? It's been so long since I played. Right. So detection circle 5.72, and the Hatsuharu detection circle is 5.56. Well, that doesn't make sense. So, certainly the tier 8s and above have a larger detection circle, so maybe that's where I'm getting confused. So anyway, you're throwing out smaller spreads of torpedoes. Your guns, you can still outturn your guns. But yeah, these ships really are a sort of a set to grind through until you get to the Akazuki. And the Akazuki at Tier 8 changes into a superb gunboat. For about 3.5 seconds reload time on the guns. Very small guns, very low chance of setting fires, but when you fire up that many shells, you can absolutely devastate things. Very high shell arcs, very relatively slow boat, large, not maneuverable, but it's all about the guns. And being a destroyer, it means that you get a lot of over-penetrations on return fire, but just be aware that cruisers will target you. So these, for the gunboats, it comes into its own at Tier 8. Just be aware of that. For the Japanese. Would I recommend these? I recommend that everybody plays at least the Minakaze, which is a Tier 5 Japanese gunboat. And the reason for that is that you won't know how to deal with torpedoes until you know what it's like to have to use torpedoes. The Minakaze reloads quickly, it has small torpedo spreads, and it gives you a good opportunity to practice the skills that other people will be using against you. So if you're really struggling with torpedoes and you sit there and think, oh, I can't stand it, get yourself in the Minakaze and find out what it's like looking through the scope of the destroyer captain. Otherwise, if you love torpedoes, these boats are fairly popular. The Shimakaze is fairly popular, although it's coming down in popularity because there's far more competitive destroyers who are able to screen for it. Right, so let's go through the, so we're going to go through the tech tree lines only. So the next set of ships I would look at is sort of heading more towards the middle. And what I mean by the middle is these are combination, right? So these two boats that I've spoken to, the Fubuki and the Hatsuharu torpedo boats, So the Farragut, the Ernst Gator and the Icarus are what I would describe as more middle of the line destroyers. And what that means is that the torpedoes are good, the guns are good. Maybe the Icarus is more torpedo than gun, and the Ernst Gator is more gun than torpedo. So its torpedoes don't hit quite as hard, but they reload relatively quickly, but its guns hit very hard. And the Farragut is really in the middle. So with the Icarus, just be aware that it does fire torpedoes single fire. I find that to be quite frustrating, and the reason is that it fires them off the rack individually rather than firing a rack at a time. So you have an A and a B rack of torpedoes, it'll fire one from A, one from B, one from A, one from B sort of thing, seemingly at random, and the racks don't reload until they're empty, which means that you end up having to put all 8 torpedoes out in a straight line. Now, a straight line means that you can get 8 hits on a ship, but if that ship knows anything about steering, there's a very good chance that you get 0 hits. So, to be fair, my preference is actually the torpedo spread pattern of the Fubuki is superior, in my mind, to the Icarus. The other torpedo spread pattern for the Icarus is wide, which is sort of just chucking your torpedoes into the water and hoping for the best. So, yeah, so this one here, I'd recommend if you love British destroyers. The guns aren't great until tier 10 when they become extremely great. So the guns are, so they're sort of capable ships, but they are more damage from the torpedo, definitely. More stealth torpedoes, they've got the smoke. Just be aware it's a fuel smoke, so if you're trying to evade detection, you have to wait 10 seconds. After you've been spotted and getting into trouble, you need 10 seconds of evasion. Hit your smoke, and by the time the smoke's expired after the next 10 seconds, hopefully your detection radius would have reset. If you puff your smoke, it'll expire before your detection radius is reset, and then, yeah, you'll be spotted again and back in trouble with nothing to help you out. Farragut is a good choice. The American destroyer lines are or have been in the past well regarded. I think there's some good ones coming through, like the Daring at tier 10 for the British line has been very popular. The Z-52 at tier 10 for the German line is very popular. The Farragut comes with smoke. It comes with 2 sets of 4 torpedo tubes. Narrow spread is reasonable, not fantastic, but certainly the torpedo ranges are a bit shorter, so just be aware of that. So you'll learn some good skills in this ship. This is actually a really good ship if you're learning your way through destroyers, because it'll teach you a bit of gunboat, it'll teach you a bit of torpedo. It does come with smoke, so you can get yourself out of any major trouble. And it's not the fuel smoke, it's the full thing, so you can sort of hide yourself in there until your detection circle resets, or try and sneak out from behind the cover of the smoke. Yeah, so the Mahan at tier 7 is okay. The Benson at tier 8 is viewed as an excellent destroyer, and it's a really easy, forgiving destroyer to use. So if you get to tier 8, the Benson is actually a lovely destroyer. I'm not a particular fan of the American destroyer line personally, because I saw so much of it out there, but when I got into the Benson, I sort of understood why it was very popular. Now on the gunboatish end of the destroyers, sort of the middle of the road, is the Ernst Gator. The German destroyers up until tier 6 are all over the place. I think the T-22 is a tier 5, and it has really pathetic guns. The Liebherr Mass at tier 7 sort of doesn't quite have the same 6-inch hard hit as this does, and they sort of come back on at the at tier 8. The guns in this ship are really good. The AP is excellent. You'll be able to use AP against cruisers. The HE is a bit lackluster, but still not bad. It still lights fires, and that's really what you're after. Torpedoes load relatively quickly. It has no smoke, so unlike the Icarus. So the Hatsuharu has smoke. The Fubuki has an incredibly good detection circle and a gameplay style that keeps you out of sight anyway. The Icarus has smoke. The Farragut has smoke. This, if you get out of position in this, you got yourself a real problem. It's quite big, it's not that maneuverable, and it's got nothing to try and conceal it. So really, you're going to take a bit of a hammering. It's not super good as a dedicated torpedo boat, because there are harder hitting torpedo boats out there. Its torpedoes just don't hit hard enough. They're terrifying, but they're not super terrifying like the Fubuki. It is a good popular ship because the guns are good, and destroyer guns are nothing to be sneezed at. When I first started playing destroyers, I assumed the guns didn't exist, and I kept trying to use the torpedoes all the time. Destroyer guns can do quite a lot of work, so just be aware of that. So if you're looking for a destroyer line that teaches you sort of some of the good habits, the Ernst Gator line, the German line, is actually a fairly good one to pick. The American line's an excellent one to pick, and the Japanese line is a good one to pick if you're trying to understand, what sort of target you are. But you only need to go up to tier 5 or 6 on the Japanese line to really understand some of the limitations of using torpedoes as your primary damage mechanism. At the extreme gun end of the spectrum is, and there are two specials, and I'll talk to those in a moment, is the Gunevny. My recommendation with this, as I said earlier, is pretend that there are... the Gunevny has no torpedoes. It has torpedo tubes. They fire things that look like torpedoes, that travel through the water like torpedoes, and that do damage like torpedoes. Just assume that they are not torpedoes. Now, every now and again, you can, especially later in the battle when ships are distracted, get in there and really, finish some ships off. But the torpedoes don't hit that particularly hard, so a ship has to be quite severely damaged before I'd risk it. These ships, by the way, probably have one other advantage, which is more player-based than ship-based, and that is they're not high-priority target for enemy captains. So if a Gunevny and a Fubuki are spotted side by side, the Fubuki will take all the incoming fire and the Gunevny will be ignored. The Gunevny is not seen as a high-priority target, so if you're the only thing to shoot at, sure, they'll shoot at you. But if there are other things to shoot at, the chances are those other things will receive the attention, because the Gunevny just isn't seen as a close range, or isn't seen as a threat unless it's close range, and then people will start to take a little bit more focus on it. It is fast. It's not particularly maneuverable, but it's very much a guns-based ship. I think it has a rapid reload. Let me just go have a check out its armory. It has a rapid reload. The Russian destroyers are all like this. They get, but with varying degrees of speed and agility. Probably at the lower end is the Tashkent at tier 8, where the agility is shocking, and it's best played like a French destroyer. There's only a couple of premium French destroyers in the game, which is extreme range, high speed, keep moving, keep, relatively, sweeping turns so that you don't bleed too much speed. And just basically keep up a barrage of fire at extreme range. It's not as good as it's not as good as the French destroyers. I'm going to have to say that if you have either the Aigle or the Terrible and you also have Russian destroyers, what I find is that the Russian destroyers really are poor cousins. Some people love them. The Kiev is actually quite nimble at tier 9. It's probably one of the few tier 9s which is actually superior in some ways to the tier 10, because the Kharvorsk is very, very, very unmaneuverable. It's had a buff recently, but still. Right, so that's sort of like the main lines. There are a couple of exceptions I'll talk to. One of those is the Fushin, which is potentially the best tier 6 destroyer in the game. I'm not a big fan of the Pan-Asian line because I'm not a big fan of deep water torpedoes, because I have a little bit of a tendency to want to take on destroyers, and deep water torpedoes don't do that particularly well. So these are a gunboat when destroyers are around, and a torpedo boat when anything else is around. Now those people that can make it work extremely well. This is actually essentially a Gunevny and all the advantages of a Gunevny gunboat with extremely hard-hitting deep water torpedoes. So it's dangerous, slightly dangerous against cruisers, more dangerous against battleships. And the reason I say slightly dangerous is the spread. The narrow spread is still pretty wide on this ship, so even at extreme range, you're going to be a lot of ships are going to slip through those nets, or you're going to only get 1 or 2 hits on them out of a launch of 4 torpedoes. But competently piloted, these are extremely effective ships. The Pan-Asian line, the tier 7 Pan-Asian is one of the few tier 7s that I've sold. I'm not one of those people that play this to full strength, so don't come asking me for advice on how to use your Pan-Asian destroyer, because my advice would be to sell it and get something else. But that's not good advice, right? That's just my advice. Right, there is one final line to talk to, and you can see here that I have done nothing to start grinding this line. I'm not really particularly enamoured of it. It is the Pan-European. I believe that it has fast, very low damage torpedoes with a high chance of flooding, and well, let me just have a look at the guns and see if I can work out whether or not the guns are good. 6-second reload average, 120mm, relatively small, 7 point. So it has average guns with actually good turret traverse. So yeah, okay, guns. How many has it got? 6. 3 times 2. Okay, so it's not a bad. It's sort of, well, it's more Farragut territory. It's sort of really middle of the range guns. So the advantage it has radar. That's incredible. That is incredible. It doesn't have smoke, and it can have 4 repair kits, which, okay then. I need to play those to sort of understand them. But my understanding of the Pan-European line is that it's different enough that, yeah, it's sort of a different play style, I suppose, compared to some of the other ones. Yeah, so probably less I say about that, the better. So there you go. That's sort of a rough, rambling discussion around destroyers. The key things you're looking at is what's your main method of doing damage? Essentially, what's your target type? So if your main method of doing damage is torpedoes, generally you like targeting battleships, larger ships. If your main method of damage is guns, you're more of a destroyer screen. So that's probably the one thing I didn't talk to, is the fact that where do these ships have a good role? Fubuki is definitely, and the Hatsuharu are definitely taking on the enemy capital ships, battleships, carriers if you can get near them. But you know, if you travel around the whole map trying to get a carrier, it's a pretty sad place to be. So these ships really are, they may be able to grab a cap, but they can't hold a cap. They can hold a cap against battleships easy, but against the destroyer, you're really going to struggle. At the other end of it, the Gunevni is very much like a little cruiser. It'll basically, its job is to screen out and deal with the enemy destroyers. It's fantastic fun if you can get it right. It can be frustrating if you get it wrong. So really, your target in this is destroyers, clear the destroyers, and then start working long range with your guns on the larger ships, and just stay out of the sights of any cruisers. For things like the Farragut, the Ernstgater, they're probably multi-role, so they can screen against other destroyers, but they may need a little bit of a help against something like Gunevni, but they're capable of putting those slams in against those larger ships. So essentially a bit more multi-role. So they won't feel as extremely effective as, let's say, a Fubuki at torpedoing or a Gunevni as gunfighting, but it'll able to handle most tasks that it's thrown fairly competently. I hope that helps you. I suspect for a lot of people it'll probably raise more questions than it answers, in which case put those questions down below and we'll see what sense we can make of them. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching this. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time.